Thank you for the introduction. Hi, my name is Sumit Bhatt. I'm Vice President for Clinical Trial Patient Solutions at Myonex. I'm a pharmacist by background, and prior to coming to Myonex, I personally interacted with patients, supporting them with their medication needs throughout my career.
Hello, my name is Todd Lukritz. I am the Associate Director for the Clinical Trial Patient Solutions line at Myonex. I also am a pharmacist by background, and before joining Myonex, I was the lead pharmacist for a research pharmacy at a large academic medical center where I also interacted with clinical trial patients.
Fostering patient centricity and improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials requires a multifaceted approach. At the root of it all is supporting patients' access to medications, whether they're considered investigational medicinal products or considered standard of care in a clinical trial. Both require clinical supply chain considerations. We're going to discuss some non-traditional direct-to-patient considerations. For example, something not well talked about in the industry in relation to standard of care medications. When sponsor organizations leverage patients' insurance, they may be missing out on patient retention. Medication access, particularly equitable access to high-cost therapeutics, is a small but important part on how to increase representation in clinical trials, and we would like to discuss this as a common barrier patients face that's not well researched. Insurance has a role to play, but it's not the only solution or option regarding the clinical supply chain when it comes to providing equitable access to patients for their required medications in a clinical trial. Patients join clinical trials for a multitude of reasons, and it's a very personal choice between their provider and family. Pharmaceutical and nonprofit organizations do tremendous work in engaging with communities and patients in terms of education around clinical trials and providing different levels of support, particularly within underrepresented patient populations. Thinking through non-traditional considerations and how patients access medications can be impactful on your clinical study.
So, what are some clinical supply chain considerations when building out your trial to be the most patient centric? And how can we support patient access to medications when they participate in clinical trials? Well, there's direct to patient strategies. With this, what are the pitfalls to traditional supply strategies in your trial? What are the considerations with direct to patient trials? There's also patient convenience. Pharmacists are consistently one of the most trusted health professionals. There's central pharmacy access where medications can be directly shipped to a patient. And in this supply strategy, there's investigational medications and commercial medications can also be dispensed. There's also the FDA's DEI guidance. What does the FDA have to say about diversity, equity, and inclusion for your clinical trials? Also, this removes financial barriers. What part do sponsors unknowingly play in financial toxicity to the patient, and how can this be overcome? And finally, we'll present some real-world case studies.
Great, Todd. That's great. These are definitely some non-traditional direct-to-patient considerations and topics, particularly around removing barriers for patients that need standard of care therapies in a clinical study and how to make it easier for them. And really excited to talk about the presentation we have. And so to move on, as Todd mentioned, the last topic, what does the FDA have to say about improving representation in clinical trials and making it easier for patients to participate in your study? And we firmly believe that making it easier for patients to access medications, whether they're considered standard of care or investigational in nature, it could help your diversity, equity, inclusion plans in regards to the FDA's guidance for your study. The FDA recommends a specific plan and action in place to enroll and retain diverse participants, and your clinical supply chain strategy and our CTRX supply solution could potentially help you do that in terms of, one, making it easier for patients to access standard of care therapies directly, whether at a local pharmacy or something shipped direct to the patient, for example, removing the financial barriers as Todd suggested. We look forward to discussing ways that could be accomplished. And these are non-traditional aspects to think through, particularly in the United States, in regards to direct-to-patient considerations.
Thanks, Sumit. So, what is the current landscape? What currently is occurring with DEI, and what are some of the enrollment barriers? Well, there's patient education and provider engagement. Sponsors routinely attempt to provide the patient and the sites education in attempts to increase trial enrollment. There's also patient inconvenience. We all know that at times trials can have several components to them that require several trial visits to the clinical trial site, and these requirements can place burdens on patients. For example, there's availability of transportation in the patient's actual geographical location. I can tell you from my experience at a clinical trial site, which was a major academic medical center, patients oftentimes came from significant distances away from the site to participate in a clinical trial. However, patients may not always have access to reliable transportation. And this, along with patients who live a significant distance from trial sites, can really hinder enrollment. Also, there's a financial burden that patients may face and their insurance status. Specifically, if a comparator medication is actually sourced through a patient's commercial insurance, whatever it may be, this can cause unknown financial toxicities to the patient. So sponsor companies can do everything from a patient provider education, in the community to increase trial participation, solve for patient inconveniences such as designing protocols with less patient visits, providing transportation such as Uber rides, taxi rides, provide lodging, and have more clinical trial sites closer to patients. You can do all of these things, but if a patient is rolled into a study and randomized to a standard of care arm where they have a financial component to it where insurance might be leveraged, this actually can prove to be a barrier to patient enrollment. I can tell you that financial barriers are probably the largest barrier among patients, even for reasonably priced drugs. I would like to paint a picture now of two patients. This is a serious and real situation, which can be the best of times or could be the worst of times for these two patients from a financial perspective. The experience a trial patient has could depend on your clinical trial supply chain strategy. In this example, we have two patients that are enrolled into an oncology trial, which has a comparator physician's choice standard of care arm, and they're randomized in a 1-to-1 fashion, Mary and Joe. Mary is randomized into the experimental arm and will have no or minimal financial costs as the experimental arm is provided by the sponsor organization to the patient. Joe, on the other hand, is randomized into the physician's choice comparator arm and is required to obtain the comparator medication with out-of-pocket cost subject to their insurance company requirements. Are these two patients being treated in an equitable manner? I would say no. Does it have to be this way? I don't think so. This is a fundamental barrier to improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials. The patient experience when a sponsor covers the standard of care medication in the U.S. positively impacts patient retention and enrollment. There is less burden on the site to obtain the required insurance approval and obtain co-payments from patients. Additionally, this would support enrollment for patients of all backgrounds, financial needs, and insurance coverage for comparator medications. If a patient like Joe is enrolled in a standard care comparator arm and is subject to insurance parameters, there's a real possibility that Joe will encounter financial toxicity when participating in a clinical trial. I can tell a very impactful real-life example from my further role. We had a patient that was enrolled into a clinical trial who 1-to-1, it was a experimental arm versus a standard of care arm. And the facility where I worked, the patient was not in network for our facility, and the patient actually was enrolled into the standard of care arm. It was estimated that the patient's financial responsibility would have been close to $100,000 for the standard of care arm. This ultimately led to the patient's withdrawal from the trial and a shift by this patient to an in-network facility where the financial responsibility for this patient was significantly less. Not only can an example like this place a significant burden on patients, but this also places difficulties for sites in attempting to enroll underrepresented patient populations. In addition, Medicare patients could be subject to no limit on the out of pocket costs for medications, which can place a significant financial burden for this patient population.
No, thanks, Todd. Very good point on the Medicare patient experience. So, for example, that patient, Medicare patient, if they were to get randomized to a standard of care arm and the sponsor is not providing it, they would be subject to the Medicare Part D, if it's an oral drug, insurance benefit design requirements. And currently, Medicare Part D patients have no out of pocket max cost today in today's design. That Medicare patient could be paying close to $1,000 a month, barring they don't find any other assistance in paying for that drug. That is quite a substantial amount of a Medicare patient's monthly income or budget, and could have a significant impact in your ability to recruit patients into your study and or retain them. And we are seeing a trend where sponsors are wanting to provide standard of care therapies directly to patients to make it easier for the patient and the patient experience. One of the other aspects in regards looking at from the Kaiser Family Foundation, looking at non-elderly patient populations, just the uninsured rate among minorities is twice as much as Caucasians, for example, where white patients are close to the 6 to 7% mark. And currently African American and Hispanic patients are double the under non-insured rate. The Affordable Care Act back in 2014 did make significant strides in improving insurance coverage. However, just because a patient has insurance does not mean that insurance companies cover 100% of the cost. They're still subject to the standard commercial benefit designs, formula restrictions, and requirements insurance companies have of patients to be able to access the medications, even if they're participating in a clinical study. And this is showing the patient percentages that do not have insurance. So folks that have insurance could be subject to high cost. And then looking at patients that do not have insurance, the rates are quite staggering in terms of the insurance coverage rates among minority patients in this country. And we already know that African Americans and Hispanics are already underrepresented in clinical trials. And thinking through your clinical supply chain strategy to make it easier for patients to enroll in your study, medication access should definitely be a considered factor. And so one of those ways to make the patient experience better in terms of being able to provide medications directly to patients is our CTRX solution. For the United States, we do have a prescription card service where patients can access medications free that's fully funded by the sponsor at local pharmacies using a prescription card for medications that are prescribed to patients, as well as we have a central pharmacy that can mail drugs directly to patients, whether if they're considered standard of care or commercially available medications, or if they're considered investigational in nature and you'd like to send investigational product directly to patients to make that patient experience an easy patient-centric one. So there's a broad pharmacy network. As Todd mentioned earlier, pharmacists are among the most trusted healthcare professionals that patients regularly go see. And it makes it easier for the sponsor to be able to administer a direct-to-patient strategy in a way that patients are already used to when they join a clinical study. This strategy could increase your patient recruitment and retention and is quite different than thinking through how patients can access medications, but a familiar one to patients. Central supply, as clinical supply professionals, as we all know, would require patients to travel back to sites. And that could be quite a burden for patients to access medications if patients were having to travel back to sites. Whereas you could provide a direct-to-patient experience in a decentralized fashion. But one of the non-traditional considerations from the beginning is if your trial is running a standard of care arm, a fundamental way to make patient experience better is to remove financial barriers and make it easier for patients to access the medication. And we strongly feel that should be a direct-to-patient consideration or strategy to make it easier for patients to directly access medications in a trial. And then being able to deliver on it in an easy way. And so I'm going to move into a few case studies to highlight some of the ways that has been done and that we continue to do so to make the direct-to-patient experience better and make it easier for all patient populations in your clinical study. So Todd, if you'd like to talk about the phase 4 study that is currently ongoing.
Yeah, thanks, Summit. So a real good example of this is a phase 4 oncology study we're currently supporting that is addressing prostate cancer. There's 2,000 patients for the study across 200 clinical trial sites, and enrollment in this study has occurred quite quickly. The sponsor chose the direct-to-patient model and the shipments to go directly to the patient's home from one centralized pharmacy in the United States. What we are hearing from patients and sites has been overwhelmingly positive. The patients absolutely love the trial because the medication is delivered directly to their residents. Additionally, some of the visits that were required to go and pick up medications at the clinical trial site that historically has been kind of the practice in clinical trials, this has been removed. So the number of patient visits is not quite as great as other trials, and the medication is going directly to their house. What this also has done from a site perspective is that it also removed the burden for the sites to dispense the medication and to account for the medication, because the central pharmacy is actually the agent in taking care of all the accountability records, all the shipping records, and all of the destruction for the trial. So Sumit, do you want to talk about the medical device study that we had with insulin?
Yes, absolutely. And this is a great example of improving patient centricity in clinical studies. So this patient population in this clinical study are diabetic patients. As you all know, diabetic patients are polypharmacy patients, or patients that are on multiple medications already when they join a clinical study. This clinical trial sponsor was running a study where their medical device required insulin requirements, meaning that patients that were on insulin already, they needed to continue to access that insulin in a clinical study. These patients were either needing brand Humalog or brand Novolog, and the sponsor wanted to pay for it for all patients instead of the patients that were on the insulin to continue using their insurance. And we all know in the public sphere the cost of insulin. The sponsor decided to make it easier for patients to access the insulin when they participate in the study. The sponsor had a couple choices. They could have essentially bought all the insulin, which would be challenging because every patient's insulin requirements and needs are different. And they didn't want to use insurance because it would be costly for the patient when they chose to participate in their study. And so what is another patient-centric way that the patients can directly access the insulin and make it easier for the patient without having to travel back to the site? They deployed our CTRX prescription card service in the US, where patients already routinely see their trusted pharmacist at a pharmacy. They were able to pay for the insulin using our prescription card to pay for the insulin that's prescribed to them by their investigator. And they're able to get the insulin as they normally would, but without the financial burden of it. And they were able to participate in the study, get the insulin requirements that they need throughout the study. This study enrolled faster than the sponsor's expectations, and it made it easier for the patient and provided a patient-centric experience in terms of how they were able to access the medication directly themselves in the trial. And so our CTRX service was a great option for the sponsor to deploy, and it made that study that much easier. And so to tie back, all the things we talked about in terms of considering making it easier for patients around accessing medications in clinical trials can tie into your diversity, equity, and inclusion plans with the FDA to make medication access easier for underrepresented patient populations. These are all considerations in regards to your direct-to-patient strategy and some non-traditional considerations that we talked about, which I hope you can take back and potentially think through for the future for your clinical trials. And again, I'd like to thank XTalks for the opportunity to speak on this topic today. And thank you again, and look forward to questions.